Every so often, I read something that surprises me. And this week, I came across these words. I don't know if Jesus was ever funny. I don't think so. I'm not even sure he was happy. But he was filled with joy. Now, I really like the guy who wrote these words, and I greatly appreciate his depth of thought and his spiritual insight. But I'm not sort of wholeheartedly sure that I agree with his comment, bar the last line. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus was a stand-up comedian, but I am a firm sort of believer that the great qualities of being human emanate from God. And humour is one of them. People who are funny are indispensable to any group. And I'd like to think that on occasions, Jesus was funny. And I'd also like to think that on occasions, Jesus was happy. I'm sure that Jesus realised that happiness is sort of a man-made construct, if you like. But all of us are happy at some point, if only fleetingly. I remember a guy, it's funny the things you remember, isn't it? But I remember a guy who I played cricket with in Auckland, and he had scored a 50. And he'd had a few beers after the game to celebrate, and all he could really say was, I'm so happy, I'm so happy. I don't know why that stuck with me, but it has, you know. Now, I don't want to sort of belittle his achievement, but it wasn't a century that he was celebrating, it was only a 50, and I don't know whether it helped us win the game either. And I've played enough cricket to know that a great score one week, which causes great happiness, can be followed by a golden duck the next. And I have to say, and I don't know whether you're cricket fans or not, but nobody I have ever met or played cricket with was ever happy with a golden duck. Happiness is sort of man-made, something we aspire to and something we can achieve. But joy, on the other hand, is a completely different thing. There's a great difference between happiness and joy. To say Jesus was filled with joy is obviously very different from saying he was funny or happy. Joy isn't man-made. Joy's notoriously unpredictable. Joy is hard to put your finger on. As Frederick Buechner says, joy is a mystery because it can happen anywhere, anytime, even under the most unpromising circumstances, even in the midst of suffering, with tears in its eyes, even nailed to a tree. You see, joy is a gift of the Spirit. Joy is God-given and therefore utterly surprising. A delight in which we have no real say. But it doesn't mean that just because it surprises us that we can't understand the nature of joy. You see, joy at its best is the ongoing movement out of the place of death, out of the place where things remain the same and are not moving. Joy is leaping towards life. Joy is connected always to newness because Jesus is the God of the living. And joy is the reward of following Jesus. It's not how we usually sort of understand reward, is it? You know, rewards are earned. You know, I'm sure in your school classes, Juling, you know, that you give rewards to students who are well behaved or who do good work. Rewards are achieved. Rewards are no more than we deserve, or so we think. Rewards are what we hope to get in heaven someday. But the reward of following Jesus isn't postponed until some distant sort of eternal glory. Joy is the very real, very present reward of following Jesus now, or at any point in time. I know it sounds easy to say this. Follow Jesus and you'll have joy. Follow Jesus and everything will fall into place. It's not easy living this way. I think deep down, a lot of us have a resistance to joy. We often think that the opposite of joy is sorrow. But if Buechner is right, if joy can happen anywhere, anytime, even in the midst of suffering, even nailed to a tree, then joy can be experienced even when it seems to be in the worst of human experiences. And so sometimes we have joy and we have sorrow and we think they're opposites. But I wonder if in fact the opposite of joy is seriousness and fear. You see, I walk around the city quite a bit, and I wouldn't say that joy is what I see when I walk around. People are serious. They are focused on accomplishing, achieving, meeting their weekly objectives or daily tasks. And we're all busy. That includes me as I walk around. Busy with the seriousness of what we are doing. We are all doing what is important to us. What we are setting out to do, what we have to do, looks more important, we believe is more important, than actually what might be in front of us here and now. The seriousness of our endeavours overrides our openness to be surprised by joy. And that's why children were so important to Jesus. And that's why children are so important to us as adults and to us as a community. Because they live in the here and now. You see, I love the young kids going out to creche. Not because they're going to creche and things will be quieter in our service. That's a serious adult response. And I'm sure that all of us at some point in our lives have thought to ourselves, can't the parents just control them a little bit more? Can't they just keep the noise levels down a bit? But I love seeing them go out, not because it gets quiet and reflective and more pious for someone like me, but because of the sheer joy they exude as they are going. And we saw it again this morning. I'm not saying that there aren't important matters in our lives or in the world around us. But let's not be so serious as though we are the only ones able to save the world. Only God saves the world, and that in itself is something to stay joyful about. But the other thing that makes it difficult to live a life of joy is fear. And we've come across fear quite a bit as we've looked at what it means to follow Jesus. You see, fear makes us grab for the safe places. We love security. We love the certainty that our routines provide. We love things being done the way they've always been done. The more we make security our primary concern, the harder it is to be joyful. But also fear makes us splash around, so it's not just sort of holding on to routines and things like they've always been. Fear makes us splash around. The opposite of fear lived out in routine and security is fear lived out in rootlessness. Our constant moving from one little excitement to the next. As though these small moments, like my cricketing mate, are the best that we can hope for in a life of humdrum and sorrow. Routine and rootless behaviour is why we chase happiness so much. Because happiness seems to us to be an island in a sea of sorrow and sadness that dominates our lives. And happiness, we believe, is a light relief from these travails, these difficulties. But as I've said already, happiness isn't joy. To be joyful means to jump out of the place of safety and to try something new. Joy is leaping towards life. Joy is connected to newness because Jesus is the God of the living. You know, we turn up every Sunday not because we do the same things week in and week out, although it might look like that on occasions. We turn up because Jesus, we believe, brings life, newness, transformation, resurrection, and in that, Jesus brings joy. And since this is a series on following Jesus, it's probably best to look to him to truly understand joy. You see, for Jesus, joy is born out of the ongoing intimacy that he has with God his Father. And we've touched on that before as well. You see, Jesus is connected to God. He never feels alone even when things turn against him. He knows that the Father is faithful. He has this deep sense of belonging that not even the Garden of Gethsemane or the cross of Golgotha can take away. Joy in that sense is a spiritual gift. In Jesus, we see that the joy of God can always be with us. Whether that's in moments of success, in moments of failure, in birth, or even in death. Jesus shows us that the joy of God is never going to leave us. And Henry Nouwen says that is what the spiritual life, the life with God, is about. It's been in touch with that love that becomes joy in us. Underneath all our fluctuations is a deep, solid, divine stream that is called joy. The love of God is a love that we can trust is there, and no one can take it away from us. All the great saints talk about it. All people who have suffered talk about it. It is the place that is home, the place of God, the place where you are safe, the place where the world has no power over you. Jesus says, you do not belong to the world. You belong to God, to me, to the Father, to the Holy Spirit. This is where all joy comes from. That deep relationship and love of God. That trusting God no matter what our circumstances. That is where the deep joy of God and of life comes from. But if you're anything like me, I suppose we like to be practical people in some ways. And I suspect we're all thinking or asking ourselves, how can we be joyful? Well, like books on prayer, there are 1,000 things that can be said. But maybe one is enough for us to take away today. And this is the one thing that I think will help us in that sense to not only find the deep love of God, but also to be people who live in and out of joy. And it's this: learn to celebrate. You see, celebration is living out of joy. We have to learn to celebrate life. Not just the great events like Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, or weddings and birthdays, anniversaries, although those things are certainly worth celebrating at every time, but rather to celebrate every moment, because every moment is a God-given one. Let me ask you this. When you wake up in the morning, I assume most of you wake up in the morning. If you wake up in the afternoon, it still applies. But let me ask you this. As you wake, do we celebrate each new day? Do we wake up each morning thinking, oh, what have we got on today? As though our list of things to do is what makes our day successful or rewarding. Do we get up begrudgingly saying, I have to go to work again? And I know ministers aren't meant to say that because you're such wonderful people. It's a joy to come to work every day. But there are occasions where I wake up in the morning thinking, oh, I've got to go to work again. Do we see it as just another day we can add to our tally of days so that we might not feel cheated by the number that we are finally given?
Or do we see each day as a gift, where God's newness awaits to unfold before us, to surprise us? Do we wake thinking that something which has never happened before, either in our lives or in the history of the world, is going to happen today? You ever wake up and think that? Do we look at the day as it starts in this way? Because I'm not sure that I always do. And yet in that is something of the secret of joy. It's easy to celebrate a 50th wedding anniversary or a 25th birthday or being made vice president of the Baptist churches of South Australia or whatever. But to wake up each morning and believe that what is about to unfold will be so new that it has never been your experience or the world's experience, that is mind-boggling. And yet in that ability to celebrate in that way, we find joy. A deep joy that resides in the God who is always bringing newness and hope and life. I have to say that I missed an opportunity the other day, probably about the 623 millionth one in my life, but I was visiting Helen Haslett in hospital. And we had a great conversation about all sorts of things, and the hip she broke was the one that she was going to have replaced, so that was a small blessing. But as we were talking, Graham came up in conversation. And she said it's 7 years and 1 month since he died. And we both, to some degree, couldn't believe that it was that long. And we both, maybe a little reluctantly, sort of acknowledged that life moves on. That we did not wish to whitewash the past, forget about him, but nor could we sort of just remain in it either. And we talked around this for a time. But in hindsight, that most wonderful of gifts, I missed the opportunity, as we sometimes do. You see, when he came up, we sort of talked around it. What I should have said, or what we should have done, was that we should have celebrated Graham. I should have asked Helen what she loved about him and what she misses. It need not have been somber, but joyous. The surprising moment when we celebrate. Simply put, being more attentive to celebrating the God-given moment where even in remembered sorrow and loss, joy surprisingly comes. Because it's in those moments of celebration that God's newness comes to us. That God's life comes afresh in us. That God's deep love fills us with joy, which holds us in all circumstances. Happiness will fade. 51 week, golden duck next. There ain't much happiness in a golden duck. Joy abides. It surprises, it delights, it comes upon us in ways we don't expect, and joy holds us no matter the circumstances. And so maybe if there's one thing we take away from today, as people who seek to follow Jesus, as people who are the ones who receive the reward that Christ gives in following him, people who are people of joy, maybe we should all take away more time to celebrate every day, whatever the circumstances, because celebrating is living out of joy. Don't wait for your 50th wedding anniversary. Celebrate today. You see, the reward of following Jesus is joy. And what greater reward is there than the joy of knowing and being held in the love of God? We are a joyous people. We find that joy because God gives it to us. Whoever we are, wherever we are, whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, hold tight to the love of God, who pours his reward, his joy, his life, his newness out upon us. It makes all the difference. Amen.